Welcome to Secret Influence TV. I interview people who have some expertise to share to help entrepreneurs grow their business and influence the audience, or powerful story to inspire and motivate. Communicating and influencing can be done through the power of writing. And as a copywriter, I write content for entrepreneurs. But also, if you share your message or your expertise for a book, you can write the book yourself or you can use a ghostwriter. Today, I'm going to be chatting to James Prince, who's the Director of Star Ghostwriters. So welcome, James, to Secret Influence TV.
Thank you for having me, Nick.
And my first question is, can you tell me a bit about your background and how and why you started Star Ghostwriters?
Well, I began life as an academic of a scientific variety in various laboratories around the world after doing my PhD in Cambridge. And I was often asked to effectively edit other people's papers because English often wasn't their first language. And more than often, I found myself writing people's reviews or professors' reviews, as well as, to put it succinctly, discovering many findings that became very well-known papers for other people. And often I was, shall we say, overlooked, hence the inevitable failure to sort of make it to the top tiers of the pyramid.
And to focus on this as a business, so what attracted you to doing ghostwriting as a business? You know, what do you enjoy most about it?
Well, ghostwriting opens your eyes and your mind to many vistas. As a friend of mine at Cambridge once said, true power does not lie in front of the camera. True influence and power lie behind it. It's knowing and being able to interject constructively or positively in other people's lives and making a difference without actually getting the praise and the plaudits. So one gets a sense of satisfaction out of seeing something succeed or helping someone succeed. I think it's human altruism, essentially, that drives ghostwriters. I think most people accept that Andy Warhol's description of 15 minutes of fame came to be shall we say, a prophecy that was fulfilled. And even if you do publish a paper in a top journal, as I did once upon a time, you are soon forgotten. So ultimately, life becomes a constant engagement with the present. And ghostwriting allows you to touch upon so many areas of business and commerce and history and keep your mind alive, that curiosity that drives us all.
And how do you approach sort of understanding, I guess, the obviously the key message of what the authors want to say, but also, you know, their voice, you know, of the author you're working with?
Well, as with any acquaintance or relationship, one has to get to know one's client very intimately in terms of what their goals and aspirations are, what the end goal of the book is. Is it going to be an academic masterpiece? Is it purely a record to allow their soul to rest in peace? Or is it something that they have commercial aspirations for? And therefore, one has to tailor any piece of writing towards not just the narrative arc, but the end goal and target audience. For example, when one engages a new client, when I do, and many, as you know, any potential lead or client often doesn't materialize for whatever reason life throws at them or us. But before I start any undertaking, I always insist that we go chapter by chapter. Okay. So that we can build trust and gain a certain sense of structured order, and also spread the cash flow of the client as a sort of byproduct. But most importantly of all, that allows us to sort of get on the resonant frequency of the client. So before a single chapter is written, the entire book is produced as a set of fishbones. So we have every chapter has its overarching narrative, purpose, and the specific points that each chapter will raise, with the end goal or message of each chapter for it to be, shall we say, holistically coherent. The metaphor of the fish or the dolphin holds true, because for any book to gain success in the current busy world where attention spans are so short, you have to have a streamlined nozzler entry in order to penetrate the audience's mind and hook them with sharp teeth. And then that, before you get to the flesh of the body, you have to have, shall we say, committed the reader to the entirety of the book. And then, as with any good film or piece of literature, you end with a sharp pointed tale or conclusion, with either a message or a stark overriding conclusion which the reader can take from the book and feel that they have gained some valuable knowledge or insight into the world.
It's interesting. So there is a certain structure which can be clearly applied to most, if not all books, in the approach you take, and the way it's the way it's structured. So would you say I think you touched on it. I mean, I guess confidentiality is important for clients, and that, but that trust as well. I guess it's the author or the writer, sharing something to the world, whether it's information or whether something personal. Is that something you find is important to the process you go through of building that trust?
Absolutely, Nick. Yes. Ultimately, somebody has something within themselves. And this was an interesting segue, because essentially I was raised in the spirit of the Age of Enlightenment, where we thought we could conquer our world through knowledge and empirical approaches to all aspects of knowledge. There was an answer, a secret formula, or a way that would make everything good and effective and efficient. And what Donald Trump taught us, I'm not saying this is a lesson I ever wanted to learn, is that human beings are wired to narrative. We're wired to stories. That's how our brains are structured. We, as the Americans say, buy the story or we don't. Sure. And all the truth in the world gets you absolutely nowhere if the people whose narrative is dominant have their superiority, whether that be, shall we say, a greatly watered down truth or a complete falsehood. So the Age of Enlightenment and scholars that came from it, including myself to a degree, have been proven wrong, in the sense that we're trying to turn human beings who are storytellers into robots of reason and logic. And only computers do that.
That's interesting. Just sort of maybe just diverting slightly, but while we're talking about sharing knowledge and using people's experiences and personal knowledge and sharing that through books, obviously artificial intelligence is a big thing now, and obviously it's ChatGPT being the biggest one is always talked about and used by a lot of people, but a lot of Microsoft browser, Bing is now got an AI built in the browser. And there's in theory you can get anything written on it, and people I know people have said to me they get a lot of their content blogs and things written on it. How does that sort of is that something you see affecting what you do, ghostwriting or writing for authors? Is that something you keep an eye on? You're aware of it?
Well, ChatGPT we use occasionally. I had a children's author who got a great success with a Penguin publishing house, and not that we did her original work, I have to say, she wrote it during the lockdown, but she came to me as a friend to assist with the editing, and I showed her with ChatGPT we could create to other animal characters for a moral narrative to be targeted in an age range of, say, 6 to 9. And within 3 minutes, ChatGPT, given some very basic instructions, had created an entire moral narrative of the trials and tribulations of 2 animal characters in the African jungles. So effectively, it is chilling how powerful already ChatGPT has become for a narrative. So it would be quite possible, it was possible before the demand effectively constrained how many words ChatGPT would give you upfront and for free, because obviously they have bandwidth limitations, but essentially they could quite happily write something would easily pass as an American TV show or serialization. Sure. That quality or some B-movie quality is well within the grasp of ChatGPT already.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you there. In some ways, it's early days still for these AI tools, and but it's certainly what they can do now is incredibly impressive. So sort of looking down the line, sort of 5 years down the line, I mean, I think they'll obviously be able to achieve a lot more. And it's a lot of people say to me, James, because I'm a copywriter, do I feel it's going to replace me as a copywriter? And at the moment, I think the best copywriters are using it as a tool, a lot, to use with their own skills as a human copywriter and incorporate it. And I get some clients actually asking me as a human to check their copy they've written using ChatGPT, so it's developed a new type of work for me. But yeah, it's interesting to see how it's
well, it reminds me, Nick, if I may interject briefly, of University Challenge. So for example, University Challenge is fairly pretentious and usually biases towards Oxford and Cambridge, and it asks very complex specialist general knowledge questions. Now, most of us struggle with most of the questions because they're all, very specialist niche questions. But if one is an actual expert in any particular theme or trope on University Challenge, one realizes the questions are not actually accurately answered.
Oh.
So the same with ChatGPT. When one is an expert on something, ChatGPT is machine learning driven, so it's picking things up pretty accurately to the extent that it understands a synthesis of the knowledge, but ultimately it's still getting good feedback for its author, its client feedback base. But essentially, if you look at anything it produces as an expert, it doesn't have human intuition, as Malcolm Gladwell beautifully wrote in his book Blink.
Yeah,
human subconscious mind is the most powerful supercomputer we know. And it can do things that our conscious mind simply can't.
Sure.
And we can't even explain how it does it. So I do chess puzzles daily in a few spare minutes. And if I can't solve the hard puzzle, I let my subconscious mind solve it. It does so within 20 seconds. And I have to work out how my subconscious mind solved it because I have absolutely no idea. So that is in there is a, shall we say, a truism that ChatGPT that may not yet understand how it's solving the problems. So it isn't truly intelligent.
Yep, no, that all makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I think we'll, like everyone, I think we'll have to see how it develops, and certainly it's something that can be an additional, like I said, that's tool to what we do and use our own human mind. Just getting back to sort of, ghostwriting. We know that. Look, when writers often have a moment when they have a writer's block. How do you handle sort of writer's block?
I've never suffered from this curious phenomenon, Nick. I'm sure as a neuroscientist, it's a real phenomenon. I've never had that problem. I think the problem with creative writing is it requires the brain in the very best condition it can be in. So the secret to it is to write, to plan extensively, to think extensively, to muse extensively, but to write only when ready. So
Sure.
it's a simple analogy. The brain is a muscle in a sense, as is the human skeletal muscular system. So effectively, if you go to the gym and you're not feeling well, you're not going to produce a very good performance. If you try and force yourself to write when the information has not gelled or clicked to a point where you're ready to flow, then it is, shall we say, not a very helpful approach. So if you touch type as we do, then you only require a very short period of time to produce a lot of content when your brain has reached the point where it's ready to shall we say, disgorge the ideas that it's been, subconscious mind has been culminating or ruminating over. Okay. So it does work to a degree, and writer's block is simply your brain saying, I haven't yet reached the point of subconscious processing of these various threads or strands of information. So, for example, when one writes about fiction, it's much harder to write, from my experience, than nonfiction, because even if it's somebody's story, you know the narrative, so it's very easy for them to rattle off from memory, and the narrative, story, and arc is already there without trying. If you try and create fictional characters, because of that powerful subconscious mind that we keep referring to from Malcolm Gladwell's brilliant book, Blink, we instinctively know something's wrong. Character suddenly changes in the middle of the narrative arc in the book or the film, or the personality changes irrationally, or characters are brought to bear that have absolutely no introduction or byway or seamless integration to the plot narrative. So the whole thing becomes effectively incredible to the mind, and therefore your brain rejects the story as being nonsense or untrue, even if the objective of all fiction is the suspension of disbelief.
Sure. Yeah, that does make sense. I guess if the writer's block, like you say, if it's partly that can be avoided by the process a writer will go to prepare before they start writing, and also the type of writing they do. Talking of which, are there any specific genres or types of writing that you specialize in with your ghostwriting, or do you cover all types of? You mentioned fiction, non-fiction, for example, but do you
we do all forms of work that clients want. Ultimately, the client comes to us with a question or a problem. I want this written, but I haven't got the time or the knowledge, or I don't believe I have the ability to write this, because writing was never my strong suit. And they come to us, for example, we had one piece of work a couple of years ago during the pandemic where someone wanted the history of slavery in New Orleans turned into a book for whatever reason. It's their own, obviously, interest or purpose. And a wonderful chap called Robin, who did the work, wonderful journalist, historian. And we were working through, obviously, I check everything and go through everything with a fine tooth comb. And obviously, there are always mistakes when you're ever involved in any creative writing process. So we produce these chapters, and of course, accessing these materials can be very difficult. It's a very rare kind of work to be involved with. The first book I ever fell into my hands, I was running an editing house at the time, around 10 years ago, and I was approached. I don't know how she got my details, but Sheila came up to me and wanted me to help her write a book of a story.
Sure.
She realized she didn't have long left, and it transpired that she was a blind prostitute, and she refused to come into the office. And so she met me for a sort of secret rendezvous at lunchtime, and nice. I wanted to take her back into the house, and I had various graduates from Oxford in English literature who, obviously desperate for that kind of work, because of course, it's the first port of call for anyone with a degree in history or English literature to go into editing or journalism as a sort of port of call. But ultimately, there's not a great deal of work, and they don't have a specific intellectual skill set, apart from a grasp of the English language. So she obviously then told me this tale, and I realized why I couldn't take it into the office, because it was rather contentious, very sensitive subject matter. Maybe the dispositions of those from the ivory towers of Oxford might be and Enid Blyton and various members of classical literature might be taken aback by some of the harrowing stories you told of rape and being abducted by an Arab, tortured, and all these things. So effectively that shows the span of the work that we do. We even had an senior African diplomat, and we had to come up with a strategy to salvage Africa's fortunes in the new gold rush for rare earth elements and other precious materials that are, if not uniquely found in Africa, then certainly predominantly found there. So in other words, how would there be a structural strategy for Africa to exploit these elements without repeating the classical failures of the rentier exploitation economies of the past colonial era? So that shows the breadth of the kind of work we do, and everything in between, from how to sell real estate to how to flip a house in 6 months without actually paying any money down, which was a very interesting little book, I can tell you. So huge range of stuff we do. It's a question of what we don't do is very difficult to think of anything, but inevitably, even in the sacred shadowy world of anonymized ghostwriting, it's still word of mouth. And I can tell you from experience that pumping very large amounts of money into social media advertising or Google advertising produces all kinds of very interesting inquiries, but very few of them have any genuine substance.
Sure. That's interesting you say that. That leads very much into my next question. Obviously, I think it's fascinating. The people you meet and the stories you must hear. Do you have to do much? Do you have to do much research for your writing, or and also do you have to do much fact checking? So if you're writing a book and you're providing content, do you need to
if it's a fiction,
check what the content at all, and do you need to do much research, or is it generally you have what you get given, you can then work with?
Well, going back to the case studies we've mentioned, obviously the New Orleans history of early slavery, which is absolutely mind-boggling as well as eye-opening. It is truly horrific how New Orleans evolved, all the changing of hands between Spanish and French and British colonial interests and the exploitation, and just how brutal that world was, and just how brutal the traditions of slavery were and became. But essentially, there aren't any materials on the internet. So the ones the client didn't provide, Robin had to go into the British Library and other sources to obtain. Okay. So that's a tricky one. The one I did recently myself on looking at the history of colonial exploitation of Africa and how it could get out of its current difficulties of debt and forge a new future as part of this sort of transitional world of rare earth elements and cobalt and platinum group metals and so on and so forth. That required a lot of cross-referencing and checking. So once we'd rewritten it, we then had to go through it again and double check every source, that every fact was correct, every assertion was correct, every figure and value that we had some plausible origin. So yes, it was a lot of copy editing for a piece of work, but it varies. But if it's a piece of fiction, the question is, you have to look at it from a fresh perspective, hopefully not one you've written or edited yourself, and then go back through it and make sure that there are no plot holes or character flaws that just will simply derail the credibility of a book in the reader's mind.
Okay, it's a lot of different stages to the process. Talking of which, how do you balance like multiple writing projects and deadlines? Because I guess you probably got a few books on the go, one time, few book writing projects. How do you approach it?
It's a good question, Nick. There is a secret to this in the sense that the brain evolves shortcuts. So we get into ruts very quickly in terms of our behavior. So you get into a new environment, you move to a new part of the world. The first thing you might do is identify key resources, the best place to get food, the best place to do exercise, the best place to recreate, the best place to engage in your personal hobbies or pastimes. And once you've worked that out, the fastest way to get there and the best way to get there and who has the best value and the best quality of whatever goods or services you're interested in, you get very quickly find yourself in a rut, because the brain is very good at solving these problems. And it refers to a term called heuristics, where the brain comes up with short, almost algorithms, little shortcuts it makes in order to make life less repetitive and more streamlined. And the same applies to when one writes. So if you're editing or writing a piece of work, within 1 to 2 hours, the brain gets bored very quickly. Even something relatively straightforward like proofreading a novel or proofreading a textbook is interesting to most of us for the first hour, maybe for 2. But if you do more than 2 hours of work a given day, your brain starts taking shortcuts, making mistakes, reading rather than proofreading, and so on and so forth. And the brain has a remarkable, just as when one looks at genetic information being transcribed and translated, the brain has a remarkable ability to fill in missing gaps or mistakes. So it assumes, once it gets the narrative up, it assumes it knows it's going to happen, and therefore the words that come are, if you like, a predictive function of the brain. And the brain very happily, corrects the spelling and sees the word as correctly spelled, even if it isn't. So after a couple of hours on any given project, on any given day, your brain's efficiency and effectiveness declines dramatically. So the answer to your question is 1 or 2 hours a day per project.
Okay, that so ties to my next question about what skills you need to be a ghostwriter, and because is it how does it differ from sort of writing, for example, your own book? Are there writing your own book and being a ghostwriter, perhaps writing someone else do this? Is there a different extra skills you need? What are the most important skills or qualities for a successful ghostwriter?
Almost impossible to write one's own book, Nick. I say that I've written many books as a scientist, some of which are a little bit technocratic and certainly of interest only to a tiny niche audience, even if it's a few million scientists. As a percentage of the world's population, tiny. Whereas I've written several books under my pseudonym. So, for example, one philosophical book dealing with these kind of questions called Crossing the Gain Line, which has been very popular. Then there's a book which is pure fiction called The Senator's Mistress, which I enjoyed writing thoroughly, a couple of hours after work every day in the laboratory in Brussels, based on my experiences in Washington, D.C. Very brief, but nonetheless formative.
Okay.
Reason I tell you this is that one realizes when one's written something and one's very pleased with one's story, and this lovely story flows out late at night over the period of a year or so, and one's terribly pleased with it, and one returns to it the next year with a fresh pair of eyes when one has time, and it is literally almost enough to induce a state of shock just how bad it is in terms of repetition, in terms of plot holes, in terms of characters just being either incredible or inconsistent. And it's absolutely, literally that one book was written and rewritten over a period of 10 years before I finally. So I'm not saying for 1 second I'm not proud of that book, but if I condense the entirety of the time required for that book, it would be a calendar year. And the reason I say that is no one person can edit one's own writing. So the brain literally has 2 hemispheres, which are equal in appearance, if not in function or performance. And one part of our brain is remarkably good at creative writing. And another part of the brain, which I believe is on the opposite hemisphere, is very good at rules-based algorithm like grammar, spelling, syntax, and editing. And the 2, one shuts down the other during the writing process. And it seems to be refractory for some time, where one does not see one's own mistakes, as we were discussing that sort of error-filling function. So either one has to go back to it sometime later with a fresh pair of eyes, which even then might not be enough, or one has to get a third party, which is where we come in. So the eye sees not itself, but by reflection, by some other thing. Correcting one's own work, especially when freshly written, is literally impossible. And it's terribly embarrassing, even if it's a short piece of work that one does for a friend. Say, could you write me a proposal for this? Or could you write me a little text for this pitch for this product? And you dash it off for them. And then you look at it the next day, and it's, especially for a professional writer, an immense embarrassment to see how many mistakes you made in dashing something off. So the answer is no piece of work, no matter how short, even if it's a quotation that's original, should be sent off the top of one's head. It should always be revisited where possible. And just as no decision of any great importance should be taken without sleeping on it at least one night, because one is in motion.
That's something I can definitely relate to myself. Even as a copywriter, I need to go through a careful process of checking my work and getting someone else to check it as well. If it's the bigger the work is, the more important it is, the more checks somebody has to do. But that's it's funny because I think you've definitely answered this question, but I've always thought, ghostwriters essentially write other people's books but don't get their credit in that sense. And that was why I sort of asked the question. I wanted to do ghostwriters often, by writing other people's books, think, I could write my own. But I think, as you've explained, it's different skills. It's a different, and every bit of content, every book needs someone to check it and write it and help write it and edit it, and it's just different.
Different parts of the brain are involved in the process. Ideally, different parts of different people's brains.
Sure. My next question is: have you ever faced any ethical dilemmas or challenges with ghostwriting sort of career? Has there ever been some content or subject matter where you've not felt as comfortable or not fitted into?
Well, we already covered Sheila's book.
Yes.
Which was written, and I got to know everyone in her extended family, as it were, including her son, and he had a very interesting story of his own. But essentially, this book, fascinating though it is, and much love that we put into it, did not. It was finally produced, and Sheila didn't even trust the publishers enough to actually give it to them. She printed hundreds and hundreds of books, which lay on the bottom of a garage floor, as far as I was aware.
Right.
And despite my attempts to persuade her, because she made reference to famous musicians and other, shall we say, experiences or acquaintances, assignations. And I said, well, Sheila, you can't say this about this person. This person's famous. Do you want to check with our libel lawyers first in Fleet Street? And she said, okay then. So we went to the libel lawyers, just the passages of concern. They said, absolutely not, no, under no circumstances whatsoever can you say that. And she went ahead anyway. She refused to redact anything. And unfortunately, she passed away before the book could be published. And it lies, I believe, still in someone's dusty attic or garage floor. And I would honestly say, given its current state, it's probably the safest place for it. Although I have to say it was a fascinating piece of work that I'm not at liberty to publish. No,
interesting. But it's interesting that at times you can refer to, for example, a libel lawyer, or you have other experts to make those checks.
Well, you have to be so very careful. There was a story that took me back quite considerably some years ago, almost a decade ago now. And I was reading in one of the newspapers that this person had written a roman à clef, which is, as you know, a piece of work where the characters and the names of the places are changed. And despite having done so, she was successfully sued for libel.
Right.
By various people, not necessarily because what she said was untrue, but it was perceived to be sufficiently damaging to those people without anything other than her version of events as to constitute reasonable damage. And that was quite a shock, because it's a Romano play. And as we probably all remember, the sort of famous book by Geraint Anderson, City Boy, he'd done much the same thing. He talked about his own misdeeds and all the characters he'd met, again, using a Romano play, changed the names of people and the, if not the industry, they were clearly recognizable, and the banks he'd worked for. But it was a fascinating approach to solving that problem, whereas you don't give specific dates and times and places and just recount events and the moral sort of dimensions of them. You can get away with certain forms of kiss and tell story.
Wow, it's fascinating. I always ask people I interview if they could just share a few tips, from their area of expertise. If someone was wanting to become a ghostwriter, perhaps they were, writing already, or do, writing in some sense, but they wanted to break into the ghostwriting arena. A few tips or advice you can share?
Well, as with any business, whether it be photography, which I know quite well, or you're dealing with editing or event management or whatever it is, you start small, doing favors for friends, and that builds into word of mouth. And eventually you start doing things for people you don't know, who don't feel comfortable taking advantage, and that builds into a business. It takes quite a while. It's also a good way for an author to build experience and a skill set up whilst they're taking on their first attempts at fiction or non-fiction, because ultimately, as we described in The Sender's Mistress, a good book can take up to 10 years to write and rewrite. It's no accident that great works of, I think, To Kill a Mockingbird was the Harper Lee, is it Laurie Lee or Harper Lee? I forget the name of the author, but it was the only book she ever published, except for one that was either posthumously or certainly very late in her life, published as a second book. So some authors literally only publish one or two books in their entire life. And that tells an awful lot about how difficult it is to write good prose or world-class prose. I mean, it's very easy for ChatGPT to knock off a formulaic narrative for a B series on American TV, but anything lasting or impactful and multidimensional requires many layers which build up over time, and again require an integration of the book that requires so many revisitations.
Sure.
And as you know, rewriting a book is no overnight experience.
I think one of the takeaways I've got from some of the things you shared, James, is that there's, if you look on Amazon, there's obviously many, almost millions of books, and it's easier than ever now to write your own book, perhaps some self-published, but writing a good book or quality book, but and it's one part, but then obviously getting it, marketing it, perhaps getting it to the right audience and getting it read, and getting that process as well is another important part of the process. So it's there's writing the book, and then there's obviously what you do afterwards.
Good question, Nick. As I still make shall we say a slightly satirical point, I said the easy part of research is making a major discovery. The hard part was getting it published with your name on. And the same applies to literary endeavors. So you see certain people who started life as prolific ghostwriters. I mean, Stephen King started life in a trailer park as a prolific ghostwriter. And only later did he get his own brand name, and publishing houses we were discussing before only take surefire bets, i.e. works by known celebrities, or if they're the authors, that is, with a guaranteed audience or market share or established brand names. And this is why you see people who are famous who become literary brand names, and without naming names, given the sheer prolific nature of the number of titles they put out and how long you and I both know it takes to write a good book and polish it
Sure.
One can only imagine reasonably that they have, if not a ghostwriter, then a legion thereof.
Of course. I find it absolutely fascinating. I've just got one last question, which is slightly different, but it's about your accidental economist channel on YouTube. As obviously interviewing you for my YouTube channel, I just wondered if you could perhaps share what your channel's about.
Well, it's something I started relatively recently. I had written a blog many years, and this is another good in-way to writing books and publication down the line. And that is, I'd been writing a blog for many, many years on world events and my perspective on them. And eventually I compiled this into a book called Mindbomb. And the thing that was quite surprising, as I had predicted, a major series of events, I predicted the last global financial crisis. I predicted the one that's coming. I predicted the rise in the pension age. I predicted all manner of conflicts. I even predicted an American Civil War, second one, which may still be coming. And effectively, this book was basically a sort of historiographical analysis of economics. The word saying that without going back in time, we don't have any data points. So if you want to know the past, as is often said, you have to have a grasp of this in order to predict the future. And those people who, for example, the digital millennials who believe that Bitcoin is a genuine phenomenon, abstracted and above and beyond the laws of economics, are going to be in for a very rude awakening. Because as many Mike Maloney and other famous YouTube narrativists say, effectively, not only is there nothing new under the sun, but essentially every fiat currency eventually goes to zero. So I made a number of economic predictions that came true. And what was troubling as I progressed more and more in watching mainstream, now commercially owned channels, which are less government orientated in terms of their narrative and censorship, but more privately owned and therefore have vested interests, is how these economic indicators, including simple things like consumer price index, GDP, and options and derivatives, all based on fundamentally flawed economic reasoning. And I'm deconstructing the equations and saying, well, actually, here's a better way of measuring it. Why is this metric not only misleading? Therefore, if you're using these metrics to predict the future and therefore make associated or appropriate plans for investment of the country or the government or a business, if these metrics are flawed, isn't this worrying? Isn't this a point of concern? So these little sort of vignettes describe a deconstruction of key economic memes and equations and metrics and exactly what's wrong with them, and trying constructively, rather than being simply an agent provocateur, to come up with an alternative metric or way of doing it.
Well, I think that I'm definitely going to be checking out the channel. I think the at the moment with the economic, I think our economies around the world and Britain being so no different, is a state of uncertainty of rising interest rates and obviously cost of living increasing. I think it's predicting, be able to sort of predict or get accurate predictions of how the economy will be and how it affects us is obviously something that's relevant for everyone. Just to finish off, James, people want to get in touch with you. I mean, they could Google, obviously, your name and Star Ghostwriters, but what's the best way for people to reach out? Do you want to?
LinkedIn is always a good way, Nick.
Okay.
And if you happen to be walking through Piccadilly Circus on a Friday, you can probably say hi to me as well.
Excellent. So if you're in Piccadilly Circus, you can see James there, pop in. But otherwise, yes, I will share your James' LinkedIn profile handle and underneath this video. It's been a fascinating conversation. I think it's been one of the ones I've genuinely enjoyed the most, because it's a fascinating subject, and a subject often we hear about ghostwriting, but don't often really know what it actually is and how it works. And certainly as a as a copywriter myself, I find other areas of writing like this, fascinating, and how different people approach it. Certainly in life and in business, I think we have to be able to communicate our message clearly and be able to influence our audience, so that they'll listen and take a certain action. And whether this is through copywriting, whether it's through social media or website, whether it's through talking on a video and sharing a message that way, we have to hook them in and captivate them and then get them to do something at the end. And with a book, it's kind of no different. You've got to have a great name of a book. You've got to hook them in straight away, and it's got to be something they can relate to, connect to, and you've got to have that interest to read and find out what they can learn from that content or the story that's shared. So do subscribe to this channel and get notified of more interviews with people who have fascinating stories to share and expertise to help you become a better communicator and positive influencer. So thank you very much, James, again for your time, and it was great to have that chat with you today.
Thank you for the invitation.